Okay, welcome everyone. I guess we'll begin. Thank you for coming on such a wonderful weather evening. But it's my pleasure here to be here in front of you to introduce our guest speaker, author and activist Robert Meeropol. He as many of you know, he's the younger son of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were executed by the United States government in 1953 for conspiring to steal the secrets of the atomic bomb. In the 1970s, he and his brother Michael successfully sued the FBI and the CIA for the release of over 300,000 documents that pertain to his parents. He's a graduate of the University of Michigan with degrees in anthropology, and after graduating from law school in 1985, he was admitted to the Massachusetts bar. And soon after a period of private practice, he funded the Rosenberg Fund for Children. And he currently serves as the executive director of the RFC. And the RFC provides for the educational and emotional needs of both young activists or targeted young activists and children whose parents have in some capacity been harassed, injured, imprisoned, and in some cases killed or died during the course of their progressive activities. Its mission, spanning 2 decades now, is to it has funded $4.5 million worth of benefits towards hundreds of children, and along with grants. His memoir, An Execution in the Family, was published on the 50th anniversary of his parents' execution by St. Martin's Press. And the book details basically his odyssey from Rosenberg's son to political activist and leader and founder of the Rosenberg Fund for Children. We're delighted to have him here today to present his speech and presentation called From Red Scare to Green Scare, Political Panic from McCarthyism to Eco-Terrorism. In it, he'll be examining the fear of communism in the 20th century, the contemporary treatment of environmental and animal activism as eco-terrorism, and the ever-present, still persistent persecution of activists and individuals deemed as political threats to the government. So without any more further ado, I give you Robert Meeropol.
Thank you for that introduction, and I want to thank Jeff Burgess and Leslie Lewis, 2 faculty members here who are at least in part responsible for bringing me. I think there may be more people involved, but I don't have their names. So, but I thank you all, and I thank you all for coming on this yet another drippy evening. I live in western Massachusetts, just about an hour down the road, so all of this is somewhat familiar territory, especially landmark because I actually spoke at Windham College in the late 1970s. So this is not the first time I have been on this campus. In any event, thank you. Before I get started, just a couple little housekeeping. I think you all got handouts, or most of you did, about my parents' case, and also newsletters from the Rosenberg Fund. I'm glad that you had the opportunity, at least some of you, to read those handouts, because I'm really not going to speak that much about my parents' case, but I'm happy to take any questions about it that you may have. And finally, there are copies of my book available. They're all owned by the Rosenberg Fund. I sell them very cheaply for $10 a piece, and I'm happy to sign them. And if you want to come down afterwards, Truth in Advertising, they were written in 2003, so they're not really new anymore. But they were written after the 9/11 attacks, and except for things like the war in Iraq, which hasn't started yet when I wrote it, things haven't really changed all that much. Well, I see we have a pretty diverse audience here. We may have, the older folks may actually outnumber the students. But for those students who are here, the old folks will tell you that it's been feeling a little bit like the McCarthy period, or that it felt a little bit like the McCarthy period in the wake of September 11th in this country, September 11th, 2001, that is. And when we talk about the McCarthy period, we're talking about the period in American history that includes the late 1940s and early 1950s in particular, and probably the heart of the McCarthy period is the Korean War, which took place between 1950 and 1953. And since it's often labeled the Forgotten War, just to give you a perspective on this, you know, recently there was a fair amount of news because the 5,000th American soldier had been killed in Iraq. During the Korean War, which lasted for approximately 36 months, the average casualty count was 1,000 killed per month. So that puts it somewhat in perspective. So we were at war, and a lot of American soldiers were dying every week during this period. Now, I don't want to give you a dry history of that period, so instead I'll just tell a couple of short stories to give you a sense of what it felt like during those days. Now, I was born in 1947, so I was a little kid during this period. And I guess perhaps because it's the Major League Baseball playoffs that are going on right now, baseball's been on my mind, so there's a baseball story. When I was growing up, there was no such thing as interleague baseball play. The American League teams played against the American League, National League teams played against National League, and the only time they met was in the World Series. Except there was one exception, that was spring training. And during spring training, there was an exhibition baseball game played between the Cincinnati Reds and the New York Yankees. And the Cincinnati won that game, which really didn't bother me much. I do have my one prop here, which didn't bother me much that the Yankees lost. In fact, I'm sure I would have been quite happy. But in any event, the next day, there were small newspaper headlines all across the country that read, "Reds beat Yanks 5-2. This caused an uproar. People were very upset. Dozens of people wrote letters into the front office of the Cincinnati Reds baseball team saying, it's not good to have Reds beating Yanks. Even on the sports page, don't you know our boys are dying in Korea? And some of the letters were even had a little edge to them, and they said, and anyway, what kind of a baseball team are you to call yourself the Reds? Well, Cincinnati didn't think it was funny. They hurriedly called a press conference at which their general manager announced that they were officially changing their name to the Cincinnati Redlegs. And that's how the Cincinnati Redlegs got their name. Of course, everybody calls them the Reds anyway. On a more serious note, it wasn't all fun and games. The commander at our base, our huge military base at Subic Bay in the Philippines, posted the following notice on the main bulletin board of the base. It said, "The Bill of Rights and the Constitution are not to be posted on this base. They are controversial." Well, when you think about it, in post-9/11 America, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution have once again become controversial. So that's really not so surprising. But in an atmosphere in which the Bill of Rights and the Constitution were controversial, my parents were on trial in a New York City federal courtroom for their lives. My father, Julius Rosenberg, was arrested in July of 1950, a few weeks after the Korean War began, and he was executed along with my mother, Ethel, on June 19, 1953, a few weeks before it ended. So my parents' case was bracketed by the Korean War. And the charge against them was vague. You always read in the newspapers about them being executed for espionage, or executed as spies, or executed for treason. They weren't charged with any of those things. They were actually charged with conspiracy to commit espionage. Even though everybody talked about the case as the Atom spy case, and everybody thought that their sentence was based upon stealing the secret of the atomic bomb, the actual charge against them was that they were part of a group of 2 or more people who got together and planned to commit some espionage and took one act in furtherance of their plan. And that's all. In fact, the words atomic bomb never appear in their indictment. Now, because the charge against them was conspiracy, which is essentially a planning crime, the government did not have to produce any tangible evidence at the trial that anything had been stolen, that anybody had stolen anything or given it to anybody, and no such evidence was produced. That being the case, and those of you who've read the sheet know a little bit more about it, I now believe that my father, with the help of others, did provide the Soviet Union with military information during the 1940s. Now keep in mind that during World War II, the Soviet Union was our ally, not our enemy. And the information that he and these others supplied had nothing to do with the atomic bomb. However, and moreover, my mother did not engage in any spying activity whatsoever, and the government knew it but killed her anyway, just in order to extort cooperation from my father. Now, Judge Kaufman, my parents' trial judge, in his sentencing speech, made the political context of the case clear. I'll just quote a small portion of it for you. He said, quote, "I consider your crimes worse than murder. I believe your conduct in putting into the hands of the Russians the A-bomb years before our best scientists predicted Russia would perfect the bomb has already caused, in my opinion, communist aggression in Korea with the resulting casualties exceeding 50,000. And who knows how many millions more of innocent people may pay the price of your treason." So the judge blamed them, the Korean War, on them, labeled the crime treason even though they weren't charged with treason, and said they might be responsible for millions of deaths. And this was his justification for a death sentence in the wake of a conspiracy conviction. Now, just to show you how ridiculous this idea was that my parents stole the secret of the atomic bomb. I mean, when you think about it, as one atomic scientist said to me years later, building the atomic bomb was an industry, not a recipe. The idea that there could be a secret that you would put on a little microchip and, like James Bond, send it off to another country is absurd on its face. But that said, this is the secret, according to the prosecution, this is the secret of the atomic bomb. This is Exhibit 8 from my trial, from my parents' trial. It says cross-section A-bomb, not to scale. It's what David Gringlass, the chief government witness, said he gave to my parents to give to the Russians. It looks sort of like a piece of apple pie with lots of squares cut out of it. I'll put it down here. If any of you want to come down and take a closer look afterwards, you're welcome to it. Now, my parents' case was not the only case that took place during the McCarthy period, and the McCarthy period was much bigger than just legal cases. It was an entire exercise in repression that the main thing that happened to people during the McCarthy period that hurt them, if they were left-wingers, if they were members of the Communist Party, or if they were accused of being communists, was that they lost their jobs. And thousands of people, even tens of thousands of people across the country, lost their jobs. And there was a fear that spread among people in the left-wing community about the McCarthy period. And just to give you a sense of the size and the scope of what I'm talking about, there were, between 1932 and 1950, approximately 1 million Americans who joined the Communist Party. Now, the Communist Party never had more than 100,000 people in it because Americans are not all that disciplined, you know, and despite the fact that if you're a member of the Communist Party, you're supposed to be disciplined, a lot of Americans wandered in and wandered out, and so the numbers kept fluctuating. But there were 1 million potential victims of the Red Hunt of the early 1950s and late 1940s. And as I said, there were other cases. There were spy cases, perjury cases, communist cases of various sorts, and it wasn't made up out of nothing. A lot of young people growing up in Depression America, looking out their window and seeing the terrible poverty and seeing Russia held up as the workers' paradise that was creating heaven on earth for poor people on the other side of the ocean, there were a lot of people who jumped on that bandwagon. And when the Nazis took over in Germany and the fascists gained power and it looked like we were going to have a worldwide conflagration, which we really did have, a lot of those people coming of age said, we're going to help. And if the United States is not going to open a second front against the Nazis, if we're not going to get involved in aiding the Soviet Union in their battle, then we'll help them. And so there were a lot of young people, I'm not talking about tens of thousands, but there were people, dozens of people, who decided they were going to do what they could to help the war effort. And that included my father and several of their friends. But the government took what was done to the extreme and used the actions of a militant few to label a mass movement, and the communist movement really in the wake of the Depression was a mass movement, to label a mass movement subversive and further a right-wing authoritarian agenda. And this kind of attack, it didn't end in the 1950s and then crop up again after September 11th. It was used to attack the civil rights movement, to attack the anti-war movement in the 1960s and into the 1970s. And I remember I was a little kid growing up in a left-wing household. My parents had been executed, but I was adopted by Abel and Ann Meeropol, who were also left-wingers. And I remember going out and demonstrating in front of Woolworths. Southern Woolworths segregates. We were trying to get this department store to integrate in the South, and demonstrating against the growing war in Vietnam in the early 1960s. And what did the hecklers yell at us from the sidelines? Well, one of the things I remember they used to yell is, "Go back to Russia." You know, this was the mentality of those who disagreed with us, that if you were a dissenter, you were probably a foreign-inspired traitor. And the secret police agencies, the FBI, the CIA, and others who were involved in gathering information for the repression that took place during the McCarthy period, they adopted a secret program called COINTELPRO, which was this program to infiltrate, harass, and destroy left-wing organizations. And that's how you ended up with the FBI bugging Martin Luther King and harassing him in various ways. And these are just several examples of the kinds of things that went on. And they survived the McCarthy period. They were sort of underground, they weren't as prevalent, but they were there. They never really stopped, and they've had a negative impact ever since. And we can talk about this more in the question-answer period, but going back to the 1950s, the federal government during the 1950s created a fairly simple equation that it was trying to get everybody to sign on to. And that was, and my parents' case was used to demonstrate this, and that was that there was something called the International Communist Conspiracy that was out to destroy our way of life. And therefore, civil liberties and human rights and constitutional protections had to take a backseat to national security. National security became more important than our constitutional rights because we were in a crisis and we had to protect ourselves against an implacable enemy. And the driving force behind this was fear. We were afraid. The American people were afraid of the communists, and of course the thing they were most fearful of was the atomic bomb. That's what people feared the most. While my parents were on trial for their lives, you could pick up the paper and read articles in New York City, where the trial was taking place, which would show diagrams of what would happen to Manhattan if they were hit by an atomic bomb. This was the climate that we lived in. Those who are my age remember going to school and hiding under our desks in case of nuclear attack and various other things that occurred during that time. Now, there are several chilling parallels between my parents' case and the anti-terrorism cases that followed September 11th. You know, in my parents' case, the federal prosecutors linked the thing the public feared the most at that point, which was the atomic bomb, to the people the public feared the most, communists, and it took place during a time of war. Thousands of American young men were dying in Korea. Now, in post-9/11 prosecutions, the federal prosecutors did essentially the same thing. They took the thing the public feared the most, which was weapons of mass destruction, and linked them to the people the public fears the most, Islamic fundamentalists. And the United States is now in a perpetual state of war since we invaded and occupied Afghanistan and Iraq. And now supposedly the war in Iraq is over, but I think it's not quite over. Well, and it worked pretty well. People who can be associated with Islamic fundamentalists were convicted by frightened juries and received long sentences under dubious conditions. Conditions included entrapment, conspiracy, and material support charges. Now, I'll give you just a couple of brief examples. One occurred not far from here, in Albany, New York. The leaders of a local mosque, this guy came into town asking for them to guarantee a loan. He was Pakistani. He spoke their language. He talked with them. It was unclear what was actually going on, but they wanted to be friendly to him, and they helped him with this financial transaction. Turned out he was an FBI agent who testified that they were trying to give him money so that he could purchase, or that he was trying to borrow money so he could purchase a handheld missile. Well, the evidence was so flimsy that the local newspapers editorialized against it. There were rallies saying these people were not guilty of any of this sort of thing. But a jury was frightened, 15-year prison sentences, and those people are still locked up in jail. There's a group in Texas called the Holy Land Five, surrounding a college professor who raised money to support a children's charity in the Gaza Strip. Well, turned out that charity was connected to Hamas, which runs the Gaza Strip these days. Well, Hamas has been labeled a terrorist organization by the United States. And therefore, these people were convicted of giving material aid to terrorists, even though what they were doing was sending money to help children to build children's playgrounds. Those folks are in prison today. So that kind of thing happened. And one of the things the government did to get these people in prison was it instituted draconian laws such as the Patriot Act, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And if you want to read the Patriot Act, I've actually read chunks of the Patriot Act, and I suppose if it's a sure cure for insomnia, but it also will give you nightmares if you start thinking about what it actually says. And when you read the Patriot Act, you find entire paragraphs that echo the laws of the McCarthy period. They're almost exactly the same, except it seems like what they've done, wherever the word communist or subversive appeared in the McCarthy-era acts, they pulled those words out and they plugged in the word terrorist. And there you had the act. And then they did one more thing. They added in a whole bunch of stuff about computers to modernize it, and you have the Patriot Act. Now, those of us on the left who had experience and had witnessed the McCarthy period, or who remembered what our parents experienced during the McCarthy period, had watched what happened in the wake of the 1960s demonstrations. We knew that it was only a matter of time before the laws were used against dissenters of all types, that it wasn't just going to be about terrorism. And what happened during this period? Well, we had the rise of environmental activism, followed much more recently by the explosion around Occupy Wall Street. And during all this time, we had the expansion of secrecy. The government has been expanding what it classifies as secret information to such a large degree since September 11th, and this has continued under the Obama administration, that there are millions of Americans who are now cleared to look at classified information. Now, why would you have millions of Americans cleared to look at classified information? You would think, you know, if you've got so many people, chances are they're not going to stay secret very long. But the reason you need so many people is there's so many documents that the only way that they can be looked at and categorized and records kept is if there's a broad clearance for all these low-level government bureaucrats and all sorts of government agencies so that we can keep all this material secret. And so we have these laws in place, a growing definition of what is classified information. And sure enough, against this kind of a backdrop, by Bush's second term, environmental activists were being sentenced as terrorists using post-9/11 laws, and they were being sentenced for property damage crimes they committed in the 1990s that injured no one and occurred long before 9/11 ever happened. And this year, in an apparent attempt to get bad publicity for the Occupy Wall Street movement, young militants who are branded as anarchists are entrapped into planning some sort of act by an FBI agent, like blowing up a bridge in Cleveland and the like, and then arrested as terrorists, and there's all sorts of national publicity. It seems like most of the people who the FBI is arresting and protecting us from are people who are being put up to do this by the FBI. So if you can't find people who are engaged in violent activity, you try to create them, and then you catch them, and then you get good publicity for protecting us. And then, of course, finally, the expansion of secrecy. We have Bradley Manning, who faces life imprisonment, charged, by the way, under the exact same act, the Espionage Act of 1917, that my parents were charged under. And you know, we have no lesser personage than Joe Biden calling Bradley Manning a terrorist for releasing this information. And what was the information that he released? The truth. He's being prosecuted for telling the truth about what was going on. What the government is doing with all these prosecutions is it's seeking to redefine dissent, activist dissent, as terrorism. But there's a particular focus on environmental and animal rights activism. That's the new equation. Green is the new red. Now, when I talk about environmental activists, animal rights activists, I don't think many of us, and when I say us, I mean people of my generation, understand the implications of what we are facing today and what young activists are reacting to. Many more traditional activists think that young people caught up in a range of activities from doing things like burning SUVs to freeing animals used for experimentation are sentimental fools who are ignoring more important problems. But there is actually a critical linkage between radical environmental activism and animal rights politics. These activists have a critique of the most basic, of a more basic nature of exploitation than traditional left-wingers have mounted. And I don't think we should dismiss it. You know, if you want to sort of strip away a lot of the ideological trappings from what people on the left have been saying, what we've been really saying is that people should be treated equally and fairly. That's at least the ideology behind a lot of the dissent. But what these folks are saying is understanding exploitation has to go beyond human equality. The traditional left critique of capitalism had to do with how people exploited other people. You know, how the factory was organized, that there was a boss who made all the money, and then there were workers who did all the work and didn't get paid a fair wage, while the bosses sat back and smoked his cigars and did whatever else he was going to do. But there was not a critique of how the factory exploited the resources it was using. There was no understanding of sustainability, because sustainability is a relatively recent concept. So from the traditional left perspective, the earth, its animals, its plants, its minerals, were all for people to use and distribute fairly. What people didn't understand is that exploitation could encompass plants and animals as well, and minerals as well. But if resource exploitation itself is leading towards environmental disaster, that raises serious questions about the basis of our entire society. Not surprisingly, anybody, radical environmentalists and others, who have taken this kind of position end up taking on the same major corporate bad actors that many people in the traditional left have been focused upon for many years. You know, the radical environmental and animal rights movements recognize that a lot of these corporations are more powerful than most governments and that they dominate our own at this point. And I think that's the state we've come to. And when you strip away all the advertising and nonsense about being job creators, what are corporations? Well, the definition I like to use is that corporations are immortal private tyrannies with one object: to make as much money as possible. Immortal private tyrannies with one object: to make as much money as possible. Now, if you've got a critique like that, it really isn't surprising that the Department of Justice has labeled radical environmentalists and animal rights activists as the greatest terrorist threat to our country. Not Al-Qaeda, not any Islamic fundamentalist group, but animal rights and environmental activists are the greatest terrorist threat to our country. Well, why is this happening? Well, you know, we've just had a taste in the last few years of what global warming will bring to this country, or what global warming is going to mean in the rest of the century. Hurricane Irene last August, those of you who lived up here during August know what I'm talking about. The great snow event we had in October down in western Massachusetts, the heat wave of this last summer, they are a start, and it's just going to get much worse. The causes are obvious. The fossil fuel companies, the military-industrial complex in our worldwide empire, excess consumption that we see all around us. And as all of these factors come together and we start seeing the devastation mount, and it is mounting, and it will mount more, some young people are going to do what young people always do. They take militant action. You know, those of us like me who are older, a lot of times we spend our time criticizing those who are younger because they haven't learned the lessons that we've learned. You know, but if you think back to the 1960s and the period when we were young and doing what we were doing during that period, there were all these people from the 1930s who were criticizing us for being young and inexperienced and making mistakes and doing foolish things. And some of what we did was foolish. And we rejected them as being old fuddy-duddies who didn't really understand what was going on. And we felt we had as much to teach them as they had to teach us. And if now we, 30, 40, 50 years later, are going to say the same thing to the next generation of activists, then perhaps we've gotten a lot older, but we sure haven't gotten any wiser, because we're doing the same thing that was done to us. And what we don't understand is that this kind of militant activism may be foolhardy, it may be tactically not such a great idea, but it is age-appropriate behavior, and it is the kind of thing that will always make sense to people entering adulthood, or at least a segment of people entering adulthood. And it seems to me that our job is to figure out how to protect those people, not how to attack them and dismiss them. So young people are going to do what they've always done, like what my parents did in the 1940s, like what people in SDS did in the 1960s and into the 1970s, and like those who shut down Seattle in the 1990s. And the corporations, through shadowy groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council, otherwise known as ALEC, the right-wing funded think tank that is proposing all this legislation, everything from the right, the words are escaping me, the Florida laws and the various other laws where you can stand your ground laws, to the kind of laws that disenfranchised the labor unions in Wisconsin and caused all the trouble there. Well, they also got the United States Congress to pass something called the Animal Enterprise Terrorist Act. This is an act which labels those who work to hurt the profits of animal enterprises as terrorists, to label disruptive acts designed to alter policy as terrorism. This would include civil disobedience. If you sit down in the middle of an intersection and you cause reasonable fear among someone and you're trying to influence public policy, you can be arrested and charged as a terrorist. And the media has swallowed this, hook, line, and sinker. They report about environmental terrorism on a regular basis. We turn on the television and we watch cop shows and police dramas and various vigilante shows and the like, in which there are eco-terrorists who are going to blow up buildings and do all these terrible things, and then the cops save us at the last minute. Well, these groups have hurt corporate profits, but not one of them has ever been charged with, nor has there been any proof that they've ever killed a single human being, nor even injured anyone. But the corporations want us to fear them. So what do we do about this political climate that authoritarians are seeking to exploit. You know, we're frequently told we must give up our freedoms so that we can be more secure. The National Defense Authorization Act, which was passed recently and signed by President Obama, gives the President of the United States and the executive branch of government the power, based on their suspicion, not probable cause, but their suspicion that someone is going to engage in terrorist activity, to indefinitely detain anyone, anywhere, forever. Anyone, anywhere, forever. Now, Obama says, in signing the law, there was a big uproar when he signed the law. When he signed the law, he said he wouldn't use it. But last month, when a federal judge struck down the law as unconstitutional, which of course it is, Obama's Justice Department has decided to appeal that decision. Now, why are they fighting to maintain or retain a law that they say they're not going to use? Perhaps they expect it will be needed sometime in the future. Perhaps as climate change disasters mount and generate more militant environmental actions, perhaps as the gap between rich and poor continues to grow and people become more and more upset over that, and there's more social stress and dislocation and militant action, perhaps as all of those things develop, this law may need to be implied. And if environmentalists react to the destruction of the environment, then green might become such a menace that it must be stopped at all cost. And just like the Reds were in the 1950s, we'll get the exact same equation. And that's perhaps why the Obama administration is pushing for a law that it says it won't use. But it is these kind of laws, rather than environmental actions which are falsely labeled as terrorism, that are the greatest threat to our freedom. You know, I started this little segment here with juxtaposing the fact that we're frequently told that we must give up our freedoms in order to be secure. Don't fall for the freedom versus security trap. Attack the assumption. Where is the proof that giving up freedom will increase our security? History teaches us that we will be less free, but not necessarily any more secure. In fact, we'll come to live in fear of our own security forces. The government will tell us that these militant young people are the enemy. They aren't. We may not agree with their tactics, but what they're doing, in reality, they're doing for us. In fact, it's their willingness to take on those who are literally destroying our world that is our greatest hope. Thank you. Now, I tried to weave a lot of different strands together there, so I'm sure that there are gaps that you feel I should fill in, and I hope I get questions to help you fill in those gaps. Way in the back.
Yes, so I had a question, and this is what my mom liked to call a baby question because it's so open-ended it's impossible for you to answer it, so I apologize. But I mean, with the topic, the nature of the topic and the way it's presented, it seems ultimately nihilistic because in the end it all leads towards something that seemingly cannot be fixed, which I know is not your point, and I would like to clarify. The whole idea of it is that we can speak up and these freedoms should not be subdued because the second they're subdued, our freedoms are gone. But going back to the correlations which we spoke about before, when the Red Scare ended, which it did not do fast and was not easy and cost many lives, given the maybe a possible correlation between that and the way the terror scare, or the Green Scare, or the post 9/11 scare, would you imagine it? How would you imagine it ending?
Well, you know, I want to go back a lot further. There's been struggles around control and freedom that have been going on in this country since the Revolutionary War. If you read about the political battles that took place during John Adams' presidency and the Alien and Sedition Acts and all the things that were happening then that led to the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, you discover that the same kind of battles in a different context were occurring. And these battles have occurred from time to time, and sometimes the authoritarians are more powerful, and sometimes they get exposed, and more libertarian interests step forward a little bit, and that struggle continues. And I don't know where it's going. It doesn't look very good right now, but I've never been able to predict what's coming next. How many people expected the explosion of protest that led to what's called the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, any of those things? They were all sort of unexpected. And it's true that the whole nature of the world has not changed. But I believe that the more people who try to do something, the more likely it is that something will happen. And so, yes, it looks like the bad guys are winning, if that's what your question is getting at. But you never can tell what's around the corner. And I think that the best way to ensure that they'll win is to do nothing. So I don't want that to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Other questions? Yeah.
You state that most older people think that young people's actions in this is foolhardy. What would be a more proactive way that you might suggest for a person that is, I guess, someone, like, what would be a more proactive way than what is being done?
Well, okay, what I've seen too many times is this, that people from what I'll call the new left have been trying to tell the next generation of activists what they should be doing. I think that we should be listening, those of us who are older, and should be, what really, one of the things that, I mean, there are many things you can say about this, but one of the things that I find myself thinking about late at night, and it's perhaps because for the last 20 plus years, I've run a public foundation whose job is to help the children of targeted activists and targeted activist youth who've been attacked. So I keep thinking about all these young people who I think make tactical errors sometime and get caught up in situations where they end up ruining their lives. And they end up in prison. And I think, how do we protect those people? How do we figure out a way to talk to people who are going to do things that they're later going to regret without sounding high and mighty, without saying, I know better, you should learn from me, because that's never going to work. So I think we need to engage in a dialogue, and we need to realize that we have things to learn from each other. And if we can address it on that kind of plane, it is more likely that we'll both benefit. And you know, I don't want to be oversimplistic here. There are plenty of people of my generation who are not so judgmental. Not everybody is like that. And of course, I'm not talking about the mainstream media and those people who tar everybody with the same brush. But I do think we face some very, very difficult times, not just in this country, but all over the world. And when times are difficult, we should focus on our points of convergence and try to work together, rather than focus on what distinguishes us from others. And that, you know, I think about my parents' case. There were many people who didn't want to get involved. There were people in the pacifist community, for instance, who didn't want to have anything to do with the Rosenberg case because they were giving atomic weapons away. That pacifists shouldn't be working to defend people like that. Well, of course, it wasn't quite so simple. Anytime there are divisions and you are in dissent, it is not a good thing. It should be, we shouldn't just ignore them, but we should try to figure out ways to work together. Whoops. And I'm knocking over my water here. Yeah. Other question? Yeah, way in the back.
Well, I'm commenting on you're saying working together, and I think my way of putting it is that we all have to agree to disagree, and focus on what's really important. And one thing I really see going on with the Tea Party and all of this is that I've come up with a term for the religious right. I call it born-again neo-nationalism. And I was just wondering, what do you think of the way all of this has been going on? Like, they do all this evil in the name of Jesus.
Well, you know, there are a lot of alienated people out there. There are a lot of disempowered people out there. And there are a lot of people who strike out and get angry in response to what they see as their oppressors. And it's always easy to pick out a scapegoat, particularly one who's weaker than you. So we can blame our problems on immigrants. We can blame our problems on, people who are in prison. We can blame our problems on the powerless. And think that's where the source of the trouble is. Instead of looking to those who are in power. And of course, those who are in power are going to want to do what they can to make the people who are out of power fight amongst themselves. But that's not really an answer to your question. I really, the rise of fundamentalism in this country is something that is pretty frightening. I would say that fundamentalism anywhere is very dangerous because it is an ideology that essentially says if you don't agree with us, you're evil. And if someone else is evil, then you can do anything you want to them.
I also would add to that when this fundamentalism happens, it tends to bash people who are of that faith that are legitimate, and they're not espousing all this violent behavior. And then those people get thrown through end up falling through the cracks, if you know what I mean.
Okay. Other? Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you thought that this was kind of a cycle between the Red Scare and communism and terrorism. Do you think that the dynamics that we're dealing with now between economic collapse, global warming, I mean, there's probably about 15 major gotchas out there, are a lot more advanced than they were in the 50s? Or do you think it's a similar cycle?
Well, you know, the 50s were certainly a very dangerous time. I mean, we just went through the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which of course didn't happen in the 50s, it happened in '62. But we almost got blown away. You know, if there had been some sort of nuclear confrontation that would have led to the explosion of nuclear bombs, the world would be a very different place today than what it is now. And I can't even predict what it would be like. So I certainly don't want to minimize how dangerous it was. But so far, at least, since the explosion of the first atomic bombs, we have kept a lid on it to some degree. In other words, there's been some nuclear proliferation, but we haven't started blowing each other up with nuclear bombs yet. Now, given what's the current turmoil in the world, perhaps that will lead to some sort of nuclear confrontation. But it looks to me like in order for that to happen, we have to change our behavior. The way we've been doing things has prevented a nuclear holocaust that could have occurred for more than half a century. When you look at the climate situation, it's the exact opposite. If we keep on doing what we're already doing, we are headed for disaster. So with the nuclear situation that was paramount during the Cold War and dogs us to this day, we have to change our behavior in order to destroy ourselves. With the environmental situation, we have to change our behavior in order to save ourselves. I would say the latter is actually more dangerous than the former, and that we have entered a more dangerous period because of that. And I think during that period, during a period like that, we really have to protect our rights to dissent, because that's the way we're going to bring about change, if it's going to happen. And so that's why talking about this kind of history and pointing out the need to strike back and swing the pendulum in the other direction so we start protecting our liberties rather than losing them is so important. Other? I notice it's beginning to get a little late. I'll take a few more questions, and then if there's anybody who wants my book, I'll be happy to sign it. Other? I thought I saw someone. Well, okay, if there's none, we can talk a little bit more informally. Thank you all for coming.